Hello, everyone. My name is Catherine Gillette, and I'm the Senior Grassroots Mobilization Organizer at Network. I am thrilled to welcome you all to our program, Faith in Reparations, an interfaith demand for reparations. We have an incredible lineup of speakers tonight, including Reverend Dr. Iva E. Crothers, Rabbi Jonah Pesner, Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, Sister Anita Baird, Rabbi Aria Bernstein, and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, all of whom have been leaders in the fight for reparations. We will also be joined by two truth tellers, James Powell and Maria Smith, who are Black Network supporters who will share about the harmful impact of racism on their families and communities. Now, before we hear from our speakers, I want to take a moment to thank you all. So many of you have been making phone calls, sending emails, writing letters to the editor, and even hosting reparations events with us this past year. It has been an honor working with you all on reparations, and I want you to know how incredibly grateful we all are for your advocacy and support. The momentum around the establishment of a federal reparations commission is building, and we are closer than ever to making it a reality, thanks to the dedication of so many. So let's get our program started. It is my pleasure to introduce Network's Deputy Executive Director and Chief Equity Officer, Joan Neal, for opening remarks. Joan?
Thank you, Catherine. I want to add my welcome and thank you all for being with us tonight to take a stand on behalf of reparations for African Americans as a result of the legacy of slavery. While this particular campaign for reparations has been going on for months now, the moral call for reparations started a long time ago, led by many of the organizations represented here, as well as congressional leaders, including Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, who we hope to hear from shortly. Tonight, we are pleased to have a range of faith speakers join us to urge President Biden to fulfill his promise and sign an executive order establishing a federal commission to study reparations, as outlined in H.R. 40. As most of you know, H.R. 40, a bill named for the 40 acres and a mule promised but never given to enslaved people after emancipation, was first introduced in Congress 33 years ago, but has never been passed into law. Since 2019, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee has been the bill's major sponsor. And of course, the Biden-Harris administration promised in their document, Lift Every Voice, the Biden Plan for Black America, they promised to tackle systemic racism and the continuing impact of slavery by supporting a study of reparations. We are gathered this evening because as a country, we have a moral obligation to study the harms of slavery and its legacy, and to ask what amends must be made to generations of African Americans whose lives have been fundamentally harmed. The damaging legacy of white supremacy and the enduring racial wealth gap it produced must no longer be allowed to deny Black people access to good health, educational, and economic outcomes. As a country, as a people, we cannot move beyond this original sin, this evil, until and unless the country tells the truth about our history and takes responsibility for the wrong it has done to our citizens. This is the work that must be done, and this is the work that we have been doing. But by summer this year, H.R. 40 had still not passed the Congress, and so we turned our attention to an executive order, which is well within the president's authority to do. And there is precedent for such an executive order. President Jimmy Carter created a commission on wartime relocation and internment of civilians, which led then to reparations for Japanese Americans interned during World War II. This precedent makes the clear case for reparations for African Americans. And so we are not alone in asking the president to act. On Juneteenth of this year, a group of senators wrote to President Biden asking him to sign the executive order without delay. In July, Network joined an interfaith group of organizations, including our Jewish, Quaker, Muslim, Lutheran, Methodist, Unitarian, and Baptist partners in a letter sent to the president asking him to establish such a commission. We also worked with the HR 40 Coalition on a press conference urging the president to act right away. And now, tonight, our network community of spirit-filled justice seekers is bringing our voices to President Biden again. In a letter signed by more than 2,000 Catholic sisters and associates of congregations of women religious, we implore President Biden to answer this urgent moral imperative, to advance justice, and to build a better future for our country. Today, or tomorrow, we will deliver this letter to President Biden and request a meeting with his staff. Later this evening, you will hear how you too can contact the White House. My friends, it is urgent that the president act now. Clearly, with the change of control in the House, it is unlikely that HR 40 will pass. Therefore, we call upon President Biden to fulfill his campaign promise and establish a National Reparations Commission by executive order by the end of this year, by the end of 2022. The commission will run for 18 months after it is established, so it's important for us to start now, before the president's first term ends. You know, it's clear, we cannot wait any longer. At this point, time is not on our side. We have less than a month to get this effort moving. So we call again, Mr. President, fulfill your promise. Help us find the soul of our nation that you talk about so often, so the country can take a giant step forward in building a new society, an equitable society, one that is finally worthy of the ideals of democracy. Thank you all again for joining us in this urgent effort. Together, we must prevail.
Thank you, Jen, for providing that important framework and equipping us to enter this space together. I am so encouraged to hear about the letter 2,000 sisters and associates are sending to President Biden. That's incredible. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, who has been a leader in the movement for reparations, Reverend Dr. Iva E. Crothers. Reverend Dr. Iva E. Crothers is the General Secretary of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, an interdenominational organization within the African American faith tradition focused on justice and equity issues. As founding CEO and a trustee of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, she has steered the organization as a unique, influential, and esteemed network of faith-based advocates and activists, clergy, and lay. Former director of the Black Theology Project, Reverend Dr. Crothers has a long history of teaching, engagement in community development initiatives and social justice ministry, fostering interdenominational and interfaith dialogue, and leading study tours for the university and church throughout the United States, Caribbean, South America, and Africa. Reverend Dr. Crothers is the Professor Emeritus and former chairperson of the Sociology Department at Northeastern Illinois University, and was founding president of the Nexus Unlimited, an information and educational technology firm. She was appointed to the White House Advisory Council on the Internet, National Information Infrastructure, Mega Project, and the educational software she developed was awarded a Computer World Smithsonian Award. She is also the founder of Lois House, an urban retreat center in Chicago, Illinois. Reverend Dr. Crothers, it is truly an honor to have you with us this evening.
Thank you so much to Sister Joan and to the entire network family. I just come with gratitude in my heart for the work you are doing, have done. And I come to share as a witness for this moment, because those of us who believe in freedom will not stop until it comes. I am here bringing the voice and the network of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, along with the Center for Reparatory Justice, Transformation, and Remediation, which is a new institution that was born through partnership with McCormick Theological Seminary, committed to the very notions of reparatory justice. And there are just a few things I want to say quite simply. I want to talk about the what, the when, the how, and the when. and the what, the where, the how, and the when. The what I want to suggest is by the power of the Holy Spirit in truth and in faith, we are going to dismantle the dominion theologies which have given rise to centuries of the harm that we can document. We are dismantling those dominion theories and theologies that in large part began with notions we found embedded in the doctrine of discovery, for example, up to the manifestation of that, where we now have to grapple with how the world sees and creates this hierarchy of human value, that some people are more valuable than others. As we have come out of this COVID moment, this now what has become endemic, we know that we not only have to think about racism in relationship to phenotype, how we look, but also racism in relationship to genotype, what the genome is teaching us. And so we are coming as a witness to say, we recognize this was a global movement. The transatlantic slave trade was global, but so is the reparatory justice movement global. And I can testify that in the last year since Durban, I have been on 5 continents in which this work is being led and facilitated by faith leaders across traditions and denominations who are seeking to undo the harm that we now see as represented by global Afrophobia, as the World Council of Churches has named it. There is an infection that we are and will commit to getting rid of, and that is what I call this identity delusion and denial syndrome, where some are deluded that they are worth more in human value than others, and they want to deny those who are on the margin. But the faith community has a unique moral agency to interrupt and disrupt. And so we come with you witnessing that we are going to interrupt and disrupt the lies and the myths. We're going to engage in a global truth-telling campaign. There is not enough critical race theory anti-movement going on that is going to deny us the emergence of our truth from cradle to grave. We're creating ecosystems around the world that connect faith, politicians, practitioners, cross sectors, and we are creating models of praxis, remediation, and repairing the harm. And so when it comes to the question of when, we're talking about right now. So this executive order, we are demanding it right now. We stand in the ancestral memory of Callie House and Queen Mother Moore and Congressman Conyers, who passed the mantle to our dear sister, Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. So from Durban to this new moment in which the United Nations has now declared a permanent forum for people of African descent, we are saying not only are we demanding this executive order to study, but not study just for historical curation, but to study what works grounded in action research, because we are seeking remediation and reparatory justice through reparations. I thank you. I thank you for all of you who are a part of the hearing and the viewing audience. And collectively, we know that the ants ate the elephant.
Thank you so much, Reverend Dr. Carruthers. I'm sure that our folks are feeling fired up and ready to engage this evening. That was wonderful. Next up, we are going to hear from Rabbi Jonah Pesner. Rabbi Jonah Pesner serves as the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism. He has led the Religious Action Center since 2015. Rabbi Pesner also serves as the senior vice president of the Union for Reform Judaism, a position to which he was appointed in 2011. Named one of the most influential rabbis in America by Newsweek magazine, he is an inspirational leader and tireless advocate for social justice. Rabbi Pesner's work has focused on encouraging Jewish communities to reach across lines of race, class, and faith in campaigns for social justice. In 2006, he founded Just Congregations, which is now incorporated into the Religious Action Center, which engaged clergy, professional, and volunteer leaders in interfaith efforts in pursuit of social justice. Rabbi Pesner was a primary leader in the successful Massachusetts campaign for healthcare access that has provided healthcare coverage to hundreds of thousands and which became a nationwide model for reform. Over the course of his career, he has also led and supported campaigns for racial justice, economic opportunity, immigration reform, LGBTQ equality, human rights, and a variety of other causes. He is dedicated to building bridges to collectively confront anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and other forms of hate and bigotry. Thank you for being with us this evening, Rabbi Pesner.
Hello, fellow activists, people of faith, and civil rights champions. Shalom uvracha, blessings and peace. My name is Rabbi Jonah Pesner. I'm the director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the largest and most diverse denomination in Jewish life. I'm honored to join this evening's panel of faith leaders. Thank you to the Network Lobby for Catholic Social Justice for convening this important gathering in support of remedying the years of injustice experienced by the Black community in our country. Our Reformed Jewish movement remains committed to showing up in coalition with and for our Black members and siblings. We must ensure that this country repents for and repairs its original sin of the enslavement of African people that has left an everlasting legacy of systemic anti-Black racism and inequity that threatens people's lives on a daily basis. The Reformed Jewish movement is proud to have a long and rich history in the fight for civil rights and our partnership with the Black community. Our historic building in Washington, D.C. was the home to many civil rights organizations and activists, including the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And, of course, for Dr. King. It was in our conference room that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was drafted and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. As a community that experienced a genocide in Europe, persecution throughout history, and intense anti-Semitism in the United States, many Jews instinctively understood the importance of the struggle for civil rights for all people. White supremacists defined all Jews as the other, being cast out by the world that has done the same to the Black community for hundreds of years. Inspired by our sacred responsibility to pursue justice, Jews stepped up in powerful ways to take action alongside civil rights activists marching towards freedom and, in some instances, putting our lives on the line. As Dr. King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to injustice everywhere. The effort to liberate all oppressed peoples remains. We also know that our own Jewish community is tremendously diverse, including Jews of color, who are descendants of enslaved African people, along with some who are descendants of early Jewish Americans who were themselves enslavers. For these reasons, our commitment to reparations is part of our internal work to create a more just and equitable Jewish community. I speak to you just over 1 week after the midterm elections, when Americans across the country came to the polls to make sure that their voices were heard and shape policies that impact people at the state and local levels. We believe that our democracy suffers when citizens are shut out from the democratic process, and that the restrictive voting laws that continue to be introduced across our nation are doing just that. These anti-voter laws function as anti-Black laws, bringing us to the new era of Jim Crow and a continued fight for civil rights, as those same rights we fought for years are being threatened. Racial inequality is present in virtually every aspect of American life. The Black community is disproportionately harmed by voting restrictions, attacked on reproductive freedom, low wages, poverty, a higher maternal mortality rate, redlining, incarceration, and more. Our elected officials continue to fail our community members by upholding a state of systemic racial oppression, a sin that violates the sacred tenet of equality and equity between people. The Talmud, the book of Jewish rabbinic literature, teaches that all people are descended from a single person, so that no one can say, my ancestor is greater than yours. Our safety is in our solidarity, And our redemption as a nation will only come through our grappling with our history and rectifying past injustices. In 2019, the Reform Jewish Movement passed a resolution which supports the study and development of reparations proposals for African Americans. We have continued and will continue to be active members of the reparations movement as our faith perspectives guide us to fight for racial and reparatory justice. Our Jewish texts are clear on the importance of restitution for wrongs committed. The great sage Moses Maimonides linked the payment of damages to the concept of teshuvah, the Jewish framework for repentance, noting that financial commitment must accompany atonement. Racial healing can only begin to be achieved when this systemic oppression is recognized and accounted for, when this form of teshuvah is actually carried out. As a member and leader of a faith community, it is my job, it's all of our job, to learn and practice these teachings, to work for a just society that treats each individual fairly as those created in the divine image. Jews also know from our own history the importance of restitution for past wrongs. Holocaust survivors and their descendants continue to receive reparations from Germany. States and local communities have already begun to embark on their journey of providing reparations to Black individuals in their communities. These examples should inform how the United States might implement reparations for Black Americans on a federal level. Even as 415 members of Congress voted to make Juneteenth a federal holiday, many of those same members are still hesitant to acknowledge the real, lasting, and ongoing harms of enslavement and systemic racism. When our communities asked our elected officials to pass H.R. 40 by Juneteenth of this year, again they failed. Together, we come today with a unifying message. The time for reparations is now. We call on the Biden administration to stick true to their campaign promise of establishing a reparations commission. And if Congress is unable to create this commission through legislation, then the White House must establish this commission through executive order before the end of the year. Let's make it happen. Ken Yehi Ratzon. Let this be God's will. Amen.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Pesner. In just a few moments, I'm going to share a little bit about Network's fieldwork on reparations this past year. However, before we get to that, it is my great pleasure to introduce an incredible advocate who we met in Richmond, Virginia. James Powell was one of the lead organizers of our recent Richmond Reparations Vigil. He is also an editor, content producer, and storyteller. Currently, James is the Director of Strategy and Partnerships for the faith-based art collective Trinity Arts, which explores global issues around religion, climate, gender identity, race, and class, in order to foster complicated dialogues related to these areas and hoping to inspire positive action. He was the arts editor and head of production for The 10th, a global independent media company that documents the history, ideas, and aesthetics of the African diaspora through an LGBTQ lens. Before working at The 10th, James spent 7 years at the Clinton Foundation helping to manage operations and the quarterly college internship program. He is a proud graduate of Hampton University and is passionate about preserving and sharing African history of the American South. James, thank you so much for joining us. It is so good to see you again.
Hello, Catherine. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and to Network Lobby for providing us with this platform. Speaking virtually, especially when you are from a call and response tradition that I was raised in the Baptist South, presents a challenge of this new virtual etiquette, which typically is asking us to mute out the din and where we're taking these meetings. Yet, the spirit that I feel from the speakers that have already provided their testimonies and is just making me raise my hand over here. And I hope that what little I have to share, you will also be in agreement with it. This evening, I was a bundle of nerves thinking of what I could say to not embarrass those that I represent. But I quickly realized my ego was getting in the way, because that's not what any of this is about. I soon realized that the point is what Network Lobby uses often when having these events, and that is truth-telling. Clifford B. Chambliss, my dear friend, brother in arms for social justice, and founder of the faith-based collective known as Trinity Arts, and I were given the task of organizing a vigil in support of U.S. reparations in Richmond, Virginia. Although I believe many places in this country are proper settings to host these type of gatherings, the capital city of my home state has a history which puts it at the epicenter of this topic, which is both unfortunate and fortunate. I'm sure that you've heard the slogan, Virginia is for lovers. I heard it often during the summers of my youth, pulling at tourist heartstrings to come down to a place where you could just fall in love. Along with the countless public school teachers musing about the importance of a Jeffersonian democracy and a Jeffersonian architecture. But somehow we glazed over that our state was not just for lovers, but it was also people who loved slave owning. And its complicated, nuanced legacy of this heralded founding father being at the helm of this wretched institution was also rarely spoken about. Richmond was not the first and only capital of the Confederacy, but by 1860, it was the most industrial, which made it the permanent capital of this breakaway union. And Virginia was the largest Confederate state, bringing wealth to what we commonly refer to as the FFV, the First Families of Virginia, leading the ton of Southern aristocracy, but also leading some of the most virulent forms of human oppression this world has ever seen. Passing this sentiment and this hatred down to their descendants and those who didn't even have that much money, or were not slave owners, but who were strivers, took hold of this sentiment and held on it for centuries with a clarion call of heritage, not hate. So in a city like ours, Cliff and I really wanted to think about what was the appropriate place to have this vigil. We wanted to acknowledge the pain because that is extremely important, but we also wanted to highlight a successful blueprint from the past that gave a nod to the possibility of a collective future. So we chose Jackson Ward. And as an optimistic historian, in every American tale, I try to find hope, and I feel like you can find Black hope anywhere. So it's not hard when talking about Jackson Ward. And when I arrived at the Black History Museum when I was 15, that I knew my life would change forever. The hours spent sitting behind the desk, answering calls, meeting politicians like Congressman Bobby Scott, who I ended up working for, and digging through the archives while organizing my boss's desk, I realized that this place was magical. And it wasn't just a story of Richmond and Virginia, it was a story of America, and later on to be a story about reparations. It does not only exist in 1920s Tulsa or Harlem, it existed all over the United States. Because as Alyssa and Catherine asked me to tell a little bit about the history of Jackson Ward, it was a place that free slaves started moving to during the Reconstruction by the 1920s. And it became an active and well-known center of Black activity. In fact, it was called the birthplace of Black capitalism, which I'm sure there's a bunch of other towns that can take on that crown. But Jackson Ward was host to a thriving, wealthy Black community. We're talking about Maggie L. Walker, who became the first not first Black woman, but the first woman in America to lead a successful bank in the United States, St. Luke Penny Savings, which survived during the Great Depression. We're talking about John Mitchell Jr., who was the editor of the Richmond Planet, that was a civil rights advocate of the persecutions of people that were going on in the South. It was a hub of culture and arts. The first lady of jazz herself, Ella Fitzgerald, and Duke Ellington and Bilbo Jangle Robinson performed at the Hippodrome Theater. But unfortunately, as we see, based on a study that was completed in June of 2022, The Wealth of Two Nations, the Racial Wealth Gap, 1860 to 2020, the gap between white and Blacks and African-American wealth continued to widen. And that happened in the 1950s. And that story is a national story, but a very good example of the why is in the late 1950s, think around 1954, the Virginia Assembly passed legislation to pass the Richmond-Petersburg Turnpike, which is now part of I-95, to go through Jackson Ward, which tore down many structures, and folks lost their homes and a great deal of wealth. In fact, unemployment to this day is still impacted at an all-time high based on an article from NPR. And we are still seeing, for many years during the 1970s, we saw a destruction of buildings and federal housing projects that were put in this space that was once home to great Black businesses and leadership. So it was a no-brainer. And so we said we should go to Raleigh and start at Abner Clay Park. And about 30 of us congregated there in the heart of the new Jackson Ward, in front of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, what Cliff is a member of, that was founded in 1856, which for many years was led by white pastors in fear that Black churches meeting would be a good place to stage revolts. Even members of the church were listed alongside their master's name if they were enslaved. Some of the first Black public schools in Richmond, Virginia were founded in the basement of Ebenezer. We also stood in front of an old armory that was an officers club and is now home to the Black History Museum. We marched past the interstate, which is now I-95, that divided the community so people could actually see what happened. Community members stood and spoke. Kaya Player and Janice Allen, the president of Jackson Ward Neighborhood Association. Kia spoke about the loss of her home and how she was given $4,000 by the Medical College of Virginia for compensation. But as Janice Allen speaks, her family also being from Jackson Ward, we lost more than just that. We lost more than just money. We lost community. Our dreams were scattered. So what we are doing now, the work that we are doing now, is so important. And what does Richmond want? And how can President Joe Biden help us by responding to our call of action in the most successful way possible? Of course, we want justice. Of course, there is monetary compensation. Of course, we want those hurtful monuments and the memorials in schools to be taken down. But what we really want is atonement. And that is related to, as architect C.J. Howard, from Catholic University says, is related to memory, identity, and aesthetics that all play key roles in the primary medium for monuments, for memorials. And through these memories, through this commemoration, it helps us to make sense of the world in a developing and comprehensive and truthful narrative. And so we are asking for atonement. We're asking for critical race theory in our classrooms. It is not just about monetary compensation. And before I keep going on, I want to bring on Cliff Chambliss, my colleague, to make sure that see if he has anything else he would like to add. Cliff? I think you're on mute.
Thanks so much, James. I'm not sure if Catherine was going to chime in, but I can proceed if Catherine wants me to. Just waiting for okay, awesome. So thanks so much, James. Yes, just to echo everything James said, and I'll really focus in on our work with the Reconnect Jackson Ward project, where we're advocating for land reparations with the new project that's covering Interstate 95. And so, as James highlighted, in the 1940s and 1950s, Interstate 95 ran through many Black communities throughout the country. And one thing that we're focusing on is making sure that at least land reparations at a minimum not necessarily focusing on monetary reparations, but land reparations, are guaranteed to the families of the displaced. And so what we did with our prayer vigil in connection with Network Lobby, we brought in community members that were impacted, the descendants of the community members that were impacted, where they actually lost land in a very unfair way. And as he mentioned, there was some compensation, but not in a fair way, but in a way that was essentially pacifying the family members or the inhabitants of the community at the time. And so what we're seeking to do now is to make sure that we have a conversation with the city council, with the city planners, with the state, and even bringing in the U.S. Department of Transportation, so Secretary Pete Buttigieg, who visited Jackson Ward at the kickoff of this Reconnect project, to make sure that if land is literally being created out of thin air, truly being created over an interstate within thin air, that some of that land goes to the descendants of the displaced. And so it's a multi-pronged approach where we're bringing in multiple stakeholders. But what we also need is buy-in from, again, Network Lobby, who's been great, Human Rights Watch, and then we're also looking at foundations, nonprofits, so that any of the funds that aren't covered by federal dollars or government dollars, that there can be other organizations that step in and say, well, wherever the government won't step in, we can provide that additional supplement to provide any type of housing that may go above the interstate, or any type of structures or parks or public spaces. But James eloquently stated everything, just as far as Richmond being a hub of Black commerce, certainly being a Black Wall Street of the South, especially of the country, really, with Maggie Walker, John Mitchell, other key stakeholders that owned banks, but that were more so concerned with the empowerment of the community and the liberation of Black people. And so I want to thank Catherine, I want to thank Alyssa, and everybody else from Network Lobby that has been very supportive of this effort and teaming up with us at Trinity to make sure that at least this small slice in Virginia, which again, as James said, is a representation or an epicenter of what's happening across the country, can really unfold in a way that impacts and contributes to the edification and the really the financial empowerment of Black families that were impacted. And as we can see, there are some of the images from the prayer vigil, where we started out. As you can see, Ebenezer Baptist Church in the background, Abner Clay Park. We have Sanaya there, who spoke, a VCU student, and then other members from the community who spoke out. But it's very, very much so long overdue. And we're hoping that we can really partner in a way that provides, again, both financial resources, but land, some type of land reparation to the families that were displaced.
Thank
Thank you
you.
so much, James. Thank you so much, Cliff, for grounding us in the story of Richmond, for your advocacy, and for hosting such an incredibly powerful event in Richmond. Now, I started this program by thanking our field, and rightfully so. Many of you have been deeply committed to this work. However, for those of you who may not be aware, a little background. This past spring, Jarrett Smith, who leads the work on reparations at Network on our government relations team, approached my team, the organizing team, about mobilizing our field on reparations. We recognized this was a newer issue for many folks, and so on June 1st, we did a webinar all about HR 40 and the call for a commission to study reparations. Once that groundwork was laid, we began planning our field campaign. Just 2 weeks later, we co-hosted a prayer vigil for reparations in Cleveland, Ohio, with St. Aloysius, St. Agatha Parish. The event, which included special guest Reverend Tracy Blackman, was incredibly powerful and became a model for future events. We put together a toolkit guiding folks through the process of how to host a reparations vigil and outlining a short program, which included educational content, prayer, song, the stories of truth tellers, and a call to action. We shared this toolkit with our field, and especially our network advocates teams. advocates from across the country volunteered to host local events. Over the summer and into the fall, events were hosted in Penn Yan, New York. This event was online and actually included Representative Sheila Jackson Lee, Rochester, New York, where we gathered in person, Richmond, Virginia, once again in person, Texas, which was online, Mount Vernon, New York, and Latham, New York, both hybrid, where they were both in person and online, and in Covington, Kentucky. We are so grateful to all the advocates who responded to our call. Each of these events was a powerful opportunity to educate folks about the need for a federal reparations commission and call on them to pray and advocate for one. Speaking of which, we hope that all of you will take action. Our program is not over. Please don't leave. We still have some phenomenal speakers coming up. However, as you listen to them, I hope you will think about how to incorporate their messages into your own message to the White House. Once we leave here tonight, we need all of you to email President Biden and call on him to sign an executive order establishing an HR 40 style commission on reparations. And now we're going to hear from someone who will certainly inspire you to take action, Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis. Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, author, activist, and public theologian, is the senior minister at Middle Collegiate College, a multiracial, welcoming, and inclusive congregation in New York City that is driven by love, period. She is the author of several books, including her latest, Fierce Love, A Bold Path to Ferocious Courage and Rule-Breaking Kindness That Can Heal the World. She earned her Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and earned a Master of Philosophy and a PhD in Psychology and Religion from Drew University. Ordained in the Presbyterian Church USA, she is the first African-American and first woman senior minister in the Collegiate Church of New York, which was founded in 1628. Middle Church and Reverend Dr. Lewis have been featured in media such as The Today Show, Good Morning America, The Washington Post, The New York Times, and much more. Her podcast, Love, period, which is produced by the Center for Action and Contemplation, and The Four, a fearsome faith foursome talking about Black life, love, power, and joy, with Otis Moss III, Lisa Sheraton Harper, and Michael Ray Matthews. Thank you for being here with us, Reverend Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, network friends. How are you, everyone? I'm Jackie. I'm so honored to be able to be in this space with you to testify to the need for an executive order from President Biden to establish this reparations task force. I was in lots of meetings today and I had on my clergy gear, and then I decided I was going to put on my real clergy gear. Shall I show you? Racism is the wrong way. I am so tired of living in a nation that treats white rage as a sacrament and Black grief as a threat. White rage as a holy sacrament and Black grief as a threat. We are going to come up upon the second anniversary of the January 6th insurrection, an outrageous display of the holy matrimony between white supremacy and Christian fascism. When that happened, we wrung our hands and we said, this is not who we are. This is not who we are. Oh my God, this is not who we are. This is precisely who we are. It is precisely who we have been. It begins, I think, with the papal bulls that said it was okay for nice Catholics to get on boats and come across the pond to see what kind of heathens they might, quote, discover, and to take their lands. It begins with nice Anglo-Saxon Protestants wanting to flee the oppression of the monarchy, but who brought inside them their own sense of superiority and landed here on these shores, deciding that they could exploit the people they found here. It begins with theologies of empire. It begins with when Constantine makes Christianity the religion of the state. the likely Black Afro-Semitic Jesus, Yeshua ben Joseph, who is a revolutionary, a poor itinerant preacher, handyman, moving about Galilee in Nazareth, which is now Palestine, a Judean, at once a homeless baby, at once a refugee in order to stay alive, became commodified, commercialized, empired. And the chosenness story for the Hebrew people is introjected, stolen, ripped off. And suddenly, these white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and their counterparts are the new chosen people, destined, designed, set apart, if you will, to Christianize the world. Thomas Jefferson, in his notes on the state of Virginia, opines beautifully about the beauty of the Aborigines, by whom he meant the indigenous people. But in that same product, and quite frankly, it's just too dark to see in here, I won't read it. But in that same product, I'm talking about Query 14, please look it up. Jefferson says about Black folks, we seem to have less hair on our face and body. There are other physical distinctions proving a difference of race. We have seem to require less sleep. We, after a hard day of labor through the day, will be induced by the slightest amusements to sit up all night and laugh. Our grief, he says, is transient. He can't imagine that Black people can reason beyond a plain thought. And in the end, he opines, he advances it, therefore, as a suspicion only that the Blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstances, are inferior to the whites in endowments of both mind and body. That philosophy leaves our country and goes to Europe on the wings of Jefferson's oratory and reputation. It leads to pseudo-race science, in which skulls from the Caucasus Mountains are deemed to be beautiful, and therefore the Caucasian, quote, race is higher, better than others. Y'all, please don't call white people Caucasians. You're buying into some fake science when you do. That traveled back across the pond to Philadelphia, where various physicians colluded to decide that Black people are by design inferior. The slave trade and its 1619 beginning here in these shores is evidence of the blatant disregard that white people had for my people. We're supposed to do personal testimonies here. My people, my Black people, my mama's mama enslaved in Mississippi, my father's father enslaved in Mississippi. These beautiful Black people who are ripped from their home and their culture, who nonetheless thrive and survive in this nation, raise beautiful Black children who had to walk past the school to go to the colored school, who were denied the basic rights of food on the table and clothes on the back. My mother, who was 4 years old when she was picking cotton in Ruleville, Mississippi, on plantations with Mrs. Fannie Lou Hamer, who was my grandmother's friend. I see them sitting on the porch shelling peas and shucking corn, and the peas are boiling and the meat is cooking, and they're telling stories of resilience and resistance. But they wake up in the morning and take their children into the fields to make $3 a day so they could live in poverty and give most of that back to the sharecropper. I'm so sick of living in a nation that treats white rage as a sacrament and Black grief as a threat. White rage is why we have the Klan, because white Protestant Christianity rises up against Reconstruction and kills thousands and thousands of Black people, lynches thousands and thousands of Black women and children, mostly for the sin of just being Black on the planet, takes their children out after church and stands on fields and have picnics and watch the people pick the Negroes apart for sport, taking thumbs and fingers and ears and pickling them and leaving them in store cases. That might sound so horrible to us, but it is what happened. White rage is why a 14-year-old boy named Emmett Till goes into a store and leaves, only to a few days later be viciously beaten, shot in the head, a cotton gin wrapped around his neck and thrown in the water. And that woman, Carolyn Bryant, who lied then and said that he had offended her, who then recanted that and said there's nothing that boy did that deserved that death, is still out somewhere eating gingerbread with her kids while this dead boy's body tills the soil in his burial place. White rage is why we had Jim Crow. White rage is why we had redlining around homes. White rage is why the tax code, the school codes, medicine, all of the structures in our nation are built around white rage's disdain for Black people's beauty and body and joy. I'm so tired of the permanent, pernicious nature of white supremacy in this nation that is now in a wicked dance with Christianity, blessing with Jesus' name and in the name of God, this vile hatred that is always directed to my people. A little girl a few days ago was out spraying lantern bugs, and her neighbor called the police and said a little Black woman in a hoodie is out doing something dangerous in my neighborhood. She's not dangerous, President Biden. I'm not dangerous. But until we have a task force that investigates the pernicious and permanent nature of white supremacy in this nation, I'm also not free. I'm also not safe. My Black life matters. My family's Black lives matter. My colleagues' Black lives matter. And we need you, sir, to take action to once and for all put the idea of reparations on the center of our nation's agenda. Work with me to end the scourge of white supremacy in this land. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Lewis. It is always a joy to have you with us, and that was incredibly powerful. Next up, it is my privilege and honor to introduce our next speaker, Sister Anita Baird. Sister Anita is a member of the religious congregation of the Society of the Daughters of the Heart of Mary, having served as regional superior, provincial counselor, and most recently as United States provincial. A trailblazer and history maker, Sister Anita became the first African American to serve as Chief of Staff to the Archbishop of Chicago in 1997. In 2000, Cardinal Francis George appointed her the founding director of the Archdiocese of Chicago's Office for Racial Justice. She is a past president of the National Black Sisters Conference and a recipient of the organization's Harriet Tubman Moses of Her People Award. Since 2000, Sister Anita has traveled the country preaching at parish revivals, directing retreats, and presenting anti-racism workshops, including a virtual address to the network community on the legacy of Black Catholic sisters for Catholic Sisters Week last year that I encourage everyone to go and rewatch. Sister Anita, it is wonderful having you with us.
Thank you, Catherine. It is a privilege to be with you, with the network family. And certainly as a Black Catholic woman religious, I am honored to belong to a group of women that continue to stand in the gap to speak truth to power, going all the way back to Selma when they marched with Dr. King to the present day, standing before the White House, demanding that President Biden keeps his promise and establishes a commission to study reparations. Dr. Lewis mentioned the papal bulls that were issued blessing slavery by Pope Nicholas V, going back to 1455. It says to me that the church needs to repent and this nation needs to repent. Reparations are about restorative justice, period. The promissory note that Dr. King spoke about 70 years ago, next year at the March on Washington, is still in default. The bad check continues to bounce. Reparations are not about a handout, but about America fulfilling her promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of justice for all. And until this injustice is acknowledged and rectified, there can be no healing and no moving forward. In order for the American dream to become an equitable reality, it demands that the United States of America restore to Black Americans that deferred wealth that is due us. Reparations will provide wealth building opportunities that address racial disparities in housing, education, and entrepreneurship. We can never, ever forget that slavery enriched slave owners and their descendants down to the present day, fueling our country's economic engine while suppressing or totally denying the ability to build wealth to the descendants of the enslaved. Slavery and Jim Crow laws, redlining, and other discriminatory policies, including the criminal justice system, and lack of quality education have put Black Americans at a disadvantage in building wealth. Disparities in access to health care, along with inequities in economic policies, combine to make Black people more vulnerable to negative repercussions. Those who can draw upon equity in home ownership, savings, and investments are able to recover much faster from economic downturns as we are experiencing at present. The case for reparations, however, is more than financial. It is a moral issue. It is a right to life issue. Our nation has yet to atone for this sin of slavery. We are still waiting for the 40 acres and a mule. At the end of the Civil War, when General Sherman signed an order allocating 400,000 acres of confiscated Confederate land to Black families. Yet, after the assassination of President Lincoln, Andrew Johnson reversed the order and returned the land to former slave owners. And some were actually paid reparations for their lost wealth, the slaves that they had owned. In the 20th century, Black Americans were prohibited from equal access to both the GI Bill and Social Security benefits. I had 6 uncles who served and fought in World War II, and not one was able to benefit from the GI Bill, which allowed veterans to secure a college education, or from getting a VA loan to purchase a home, thereby creating the middle class. When Social Security went into effect, domestic and farm laborers, the majority who were Black, were exempt from qualifying to receive benefits. We all know about redlining laws and restrictive covenants that have kept Black Americans from the one sure means of building wealth, and that is home ownership. And the list could go on and on. We have waited long enough. Now is the time. The promissory note is long overdue. It's time to set the record straight. It's time to pay reparations to the descendants of the enslaved Africans. As the great poet Langston Hughes cautions us in his famous poem, A Raisin in the Sun, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? We have waited long enough. The Biden administration must uphold its promise to African Americans. It must keep its promise to act now to correct this festering injustice once and for all by issuing an executive order to establish a National Reparations Commission to study this issue. It is a matter of justice. It is a matter of life. Now is the time. now is the day for reparations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Anita. That was very compelling, inspiring. You've given us a lot to think about. Next up, we are joined by Rabbi Aryeh Bernstein. Rabbi Bernstein has written and taught extensively about the case for slavery reparations in Torah and rabbinic literature, including the 2018 article, The Torah Case for Reparations. Rabbi Bernstein is a fifth-generation Chicago Southsider who works as a national Jewish educator for Avodah, an educational consultant for the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. He is a senior editor of JewSchool.com and a member of the Zedek Lab. Rabbi Bernstein studied at several institutions of higher rabbinical studies and was ordained by Rabbi Daniel Landau's Yashra Institute. Rabbi Bernstein, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me. I join you in solidarity of spirit and scripture with my siblings in Catholic and other communities. It's an honor to be here. I'm coming to represent a Torah tradition. And one of the upshots of that to President Biden is that, contrary to the trolling of the popular American imagination, that reparations are a radical, outlandish, out there idea, representing the ancient, continuing, eternal, and contemporary Torah and rabbinic tradition, I come here as a Jewish person saying that in our tradition, reparations are not radical, they're not out there. In fact, they're the most normal, most legally obvious, and in fact, foundational piece of our most central mythic story. Let's review our scriptures. The first time that the central story that becomes to be identified as the identity forming story of the Jewish people, liberation from slavery by God from a tyrannical enslaver. The very first time we find out in the Torah that slavery is going to happen, in Genesis chapter 15, God speaks to Abraham, the covenant between the pieces. Here's the deal. Know for sure that your seed will be an alien in a land not their own and shall serve them, and they shall abuse them 400 years. And also that nation whom they shall serve will I judge. And afterward, they shall come out with significant property. Abraham had not been nervous about wealth. He was already wealthy. God tells him things are going to get rough. Your descendants are going to be enslaved, and they're going to be liberated, and they're going to come out with significant property. Years later, hundreds of years of slavery later, in Exodus chapter 3, Moses at the burning bush, God is pressing on Moses and the importance for him to go back and play his part in participating in the liberation of his community. And God says, I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so that when you go, you will not go empty. But every woman shall ask of her neighbor and of the one lodging in her house silver and gold items and clothing. And you shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters, and you shall clean out the Egyptians. When Moses is promised that despite all the hardships, liberation is going to happen, the most detail in describing the liberation is the detail of reparations. Exodus chapter 3. 8 chapters and 9 plagues later, Exodus chapter 11. It's on the eve of the plague of the firstborn. Egypt is in free fall. The economy has collapsed through the 9 crippling plagues. And God says to Moses, one more plague will I bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt, and afterwards he will send you out of here. And when he sends you, he will completely expel you. Speak, please, in the ears of the people, that they ask each man of his neighbor and each woman of her neighbor silver items and gold items. And Adonai, God, the Lord, gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, in the sight of the people. On the eve of the liberation, God, reducing God's self to plead with human beings and saying, do not forget to take liberation, to take reparations. And finally, in the description, Exodus chapter 12, and it happened at midnight, Adonai smote every firstborn in the land of Egypt. Pharaoh rose up and he called and said, get out from among the people. Serve Adonai as you have said. Take everything. And the Egyptians urged the people on, sending them out, saying, we'll all be dead. And the people took their dough before it was leavened, their kneading troughs being bound up in their clothes upon their shoulders. And the children of Israel did according to the word of Moses. And they asked of the Egyptians silver items and gold items and clothing. And Adonai, the Lord, gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians, so they let them have what they asked. They cleaned out the Egyptians. As a Jewish community, we always have, and we continue to live through a Torah that insists that we must support reparations because we took reparations for our slave labor. We were commanded by God to do so, and we were promised these reparations in the earliest divine plan for our liberation. That there is no liberation without reparations. God will even plead with human beings to make sure that they take what is rightfully theirs. This has legal echo in Deuteronomy chapter 15, the passage that Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote as a précis to his magnum opus article, that in the regular economy, not chattel slavery, in economies of poverty and wealth and potential exploitation, if somebody is paying off a debt with labor, the book of Deuteronomy refers back to the Exodus passages and says, when you send somebody who is paying off debt with labor, first of all, there's a time limit on it. And when you send them free, do not send them empty. Chapter 15, furnish them liberally from your flock and from your threshing floor. And remember that you are a slave in the land of Egypt, and Adonai your God redeemed you. And our most prominent medieval commentator, Rashi, makes sure that we don't miss the point. Why does God say, remember you were a slave? What's being described here isn't chattel slavery. Remember you were a slave and I furnished you. I, God, furnished you and gave to you from the spoils of Egypt. So too you must furnish and give to your departing indentured employee twice over. The rabbinic tradition is emphatic, lest you think, well, these don't sound a lot like reparations, sounds like a money grab. Ideally, the Egyptian government would have repented and created an HR 40 and a reparations committee. They weren't going to do that. And so God validates his reparations by any means necessary, the liberated people taking what is rightfully theirs. There's a piquant story in the Babylonian Talmud, Tractate Sanhedrin, that imagines an international lawsuit in the court of Alexander the Great, sort of the Talmudic equivalent of The Hague today, a legal court that has jurisdiction both over the Jewish people and the Egyptian people. The Egyptians come and sue the Jewish people in Alexander the Great's court and says, hey, when our ancestors, quoting Exodus 12:36, gave all that property to you, it was a loan. Give us the silver and gold that you took from us. Which reminds us of the ways in which the American government actually gave reparations to enslavers for their so-called lost property. The rabbinic response is to countersue and to say, from where do you bring the evidence? From the Egyptians say, from the Torah. So they say, well, I'm going to bring evidence from the Torah as well. 4 verses later. And the Israelites' residence, which they resided in Egypt, was 430 years. Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. Give us payment for the labor of 600,000 whom you enslaved in Egypt for all those years. Mic drop. Alexander the Great gives the Egyptian lawyers time to give an answer, and they don't show up again. And that's the happy ending of the story. The idea being, reparations are so fundamental, foundational, and obvious to liberation. The enslavers were lucky that they got off with giving only with losing only what was taken to them. If you want to really pull out your pens and papers and calculate what was taken on the way out, liberation against what was owed, the Egyptians were lucky, and they would probably owe even more. It's been heartening to see so many over the last several years. So many people, civilians in our country, as well as members of Congress, come around to supporting HR 40 and the case for reparations, including presidential candidate Joe Biden just 2 years ago. That was very heartening. And it is time today, for President Joe Biden to agree with candidate Joe Biden and to follow the campaign promise. As a man of faith, I believe that he's a person who believes that lying is bad and keeping your word is good. Reparations are not some harebrained out there idea. They're the most obvious thing. They are a part of the mythic scriptural tradition of the liberation of slaves from Egypt. There is no liberation without reparations. President Biden signed the executive order today. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Rabbi Bernstein. We are so glad you were able to join us today. Next up, we have our next truth teller. I'm honored to introduce Maria Smith. Maria lives in Cleveland, Ohio, blocks away from where police killed Tamir Rice. She is a 1980 graduate of the University of Missouri and a 1983 graduate of the University of Virginia Law School. She considers 2 adult postgraduate experiences as formative in understanding the violence of racism, working for the Witness for Peace in Nicaragua during the Contra War, and living in a favela in Recife in Brazil. Her work as a lawyer includes representing clients who are victims of mass incarceration and civil matters by attempting to remove the collateral consequences of criminal conviction that create barriers to housing, and represents clients who, as a legacy of redlining and predatory lending, are dealing with the affordable rental housing crisis. In dealing with both issues, she seeks to frame housing as a human right. Maria, we are so grateful to have you with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, everyone, for your powerful witnesses this evening. My talk involves 3 points. The points are intended to address some of the criticisms and questions often articulated in opposition to reparations. The first point I use the word to refer to is quotidian racism. It will involve a story about my mother's childhood in rural Missouri. The second point involves how that story reveals resources that can address questions of documenting family histories and the reparations that they would be entitled to. The third point involves a framework in which we can view reparations. We are learning and relearning the horrific stories of massacres of Black communities, such as Tulsa, Oklahoma, Elaine, Arkansas, East Cleveland, East St. Louis, and in 1917, and the Rosewood massacres and more. We are learning and documenting lynchings. In Missouri, from 1877 to 1950, Missouri had more lynchings than any other state outside the Deep South. These are horrific and traumatic accounts of the brutality of racism. Tonight, my account, however, is about what I mentioned, quotidian racism. I use that to talk about the day-to-day grinding, air we breathe racism, insidious because it robs children of their confidence and love of self, as revealed in Mamie Phipps Clark, The Doll Test, internalized racism that lives like a virus in the structures and culture and desensitizes us to the actual physical violence that racism ultimately perpetuates. So here's the brief story. Have you experienced the death of a loved one like your mother, especially your mother? The first heartbeat we hear in our lives was our mother's. What do we feel when that heart stops? February 29th, 1940 is the day my mother and my aunt lost their mother. They were 13 and 12 years old. For them, it was the coldest, grayest day imaginable. For the United States, February 29th, 1940 was the day Hattie McDaniels became the first Black person to receive an Academy Award for her performance in Gone with the Wind, the blockbuster movie that the NAACP feared would fuel a positive perception of the Ku Klux Klan and more derogatory stereotypes of African Americans. Gone with the Wind was the polemic of its day. My mother and aunt, born in Harrisonville, Missouri, along with cousins and neighbors, attended the Prince Whipple School. Prince Whipple School was a one-room schoolhouse for Black children. It was named after an African who was enslaved to Captain William Whipple during the Revolutionary War. Prince Whipple is depicted in Emmanuel Gottlieb Lutz's painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. For me, the name reflects a reminder of how Africans contributed to the very founding of this nation. Prince Whipple School had 2 teachers, Mr. and Mrs. Green, who taught all children up to the 8th grade. The entrance of Prince Whipple School had a portrait of Carter Woodson, the thought leader on race theory, a founder of the Black History Month. I consider Carter West to be the Cornel West of our time. I imagine my mother's humble one-room school education imbued with racial pride, contrary to the stereotype of one-room school education that I had held for many years. The children who graduated from Prince Whipple School could not attend high school in Harrisonville. Harrisonville had a high school, but it was only for white students. Prince Whipple grads, Black children, had to either forego a high school education or travel to Kansas City to attend an all-Black high school there. When my mother was ready for high school, my grandfather and other Black men tried to organize a school bus that would take Black children to Kansas City to high school. The white merchants would not permit it. As a result, my mother, a motherless child, found herself shipped off 1,192 miles from Harrisonville to Scottsdale, Arizona. There she was to work in a laundry during the day and attend high school at night. Having suffered the death of her mother and missing her dear sister, Helen, it was too much for her. She returned to Harrisonville. She never completed high school. The second point, when I was in 8th grade, my mother surprised me with a trip on a Greyhound bus. We lived in Jefferson City, Missouri. I was attending, ironically, an all-white Catholic grade school. I was the only Black student. She had converted to Roman Catholicism and sent me to Immaculate Conception Elementary School. My brother, who was 6 years older than I, refused to attend school there. She capitulated and allowed him to go to Lincoln Laboratory School, an all-Black elementary school and high school. Anyway, my mother and I took a safe trip to meet 2 people. As far as I could recall, she had never mentioned them, Mr. and Mrs. Green, the teachers at Prince Whipple School. I felt as if I were on display. Here I was in the 8th grade. My mother was so proud, and I was so clueless why. I had no awareness that her mother had died when she was my age. I had no idea why Mr. and Mrs. Green did not seem to be old enough to have been my mother's teachers. They looked the same age as my mother. They were, in fact, only a few years older. I really did not think about the visit again until my son graduated from Amherst College. Here he had one of the most elite educations one could receive in the United States. Such a contrast from my mother's. I decided I would visit Harrisonville with him and explore. That opportunity did not come until 2015. We went to Harrisonville, curious about my mother's childhood and the one-room schoolhouse. My husband, Charlie, our son, Alexander, and my Aunt Helen took the road trip to Harrisonville. My mother did not want to go. All information, including the portrait of Carter Woodson, the whereabouts of Prince Whipple School, the plaque, the news articles that reported my grandmother's death, including that they sang Precious Lord at her funeral, I received at the Cass County Historical Society in 2015. I left with greater curiosity based on one comment. As the staff of the Historical Society pulled out information on the Prince Whipple School, census reports, news articles about other family members, another staff person offered that if we had time, she would go into the basement and retrieve probate records to see when my people were included as slaves in probate inventories. There are plenty of documents available for family histories. There are plenty of resources available to us now to repair the broken relationships. Point number 3, reparations for me are part of a framework, a practice, a discipline that helps me not to be depressed about the past oppression and the dangers lurking today. The framework is one the Cleveland Nonviolence Network used as scaffolding in the People's Justice and Peace Convention in 2016. The convention was held in the tradition of the Women's Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848, which Frederick Douglass attended, and the Women's Rights Convention on May 29, 1851 in Akron, Ohio, in which Sojourner Truth asked, "Ain't I a woman?" The framework provides 5 practices of nonviolence: radical amazement, radical hospitality, good stewardship to create shared abundance, compassion for every sentient being and ecosystem, and most importantly, truth, reparations, and reconciliation. I urge President Biden and his administration to form a federal commission on reparations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria, for sharing your story, your family's story, and so much more with us. I'm so grateful you were able to be here. Now, we had hoped that Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee would be able to join us. Unfortunately, she had a last-minute change in her schedule and won't be able to make it. However, we remain immensely grateful for her tireless advocacy and leadership in this movement. And so now, to close us out, I'd like to welcome back Sister Anita to lead our closing prayer.
Thank you, Catherine. This prayer is adapted from the Prayer of Apology by Emily Walker Garnetta and a prayer of thanksgiving by Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. Let us pray. God of truth and justice, we acknowledge the enduring presence of racism in the origins of this nation, in our institutions and politics, in our faith traditions, and in our hearts. Some of us are much too familiar with racism's many violent aggressions and everyday microaggressions. Others have at times chosen the false comfort of ignorance and privilege over the cost and freedom of truth. We stand before you acknowledging our guilt and the harm it has caused your children of African descent. We repent for the many ways, social, economic, and political, that white supremacy has accrued benefits to some at the expense of others. We repent for the many ways that racist ideology has flowed into our hearts and has corrupted our spirits. Grant us, loving God, forgiveness for our complicity with white supremacy and greed that gave birth to chattel slavery and continues its legacy even to this day. Grant us, liberating God, the oral wisdom, moral leadership, and courage to continue the work of freedom until our world and society becomes a place free from the sins of white supremacy, anti-Blackness, and all other isms that would betray the justice that you desire for all of your children. May our nation and its people be made whole through your call for reparative justice for the descendants of the enslaved. We make this prayer in faith, and let the people of God say, Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Sister Anita. It is my hope that you all found our time together at this event educational and motivating. Thank you to all of our amazing speakers, and a special shout out to all of my colleagues who braved the cold at the White House with our letter this evening. As I shared with you before, the Biden administration needs to hear from every single one of you on this program tonight. Please use the link in the comments to visit Network's website and submit a personalized email to the Biden administration calling on President Biden to sign an executive order establishing an HR 40-style commission on reparations. We will also be sure to include the link to this in our follow-up email. Once you have taken action, I encourage you to amplify your effort by talking with a couple of your friends about this important topic, maybe posting on your social media, and encouraging others to take action as well. Your advocacy and support are greatly appreciated and necessary if we're going to turn this vision into a reality. Thank you all for your commitment to justice. I hope you all have a great night.